Hi, today we're talking about absolute value, opposites, and reciprocals. Absolute value of a number is just a number's distance from zero. It could be that it's to the left of zero or to the right of zero. And a distance is always positive. So if we were talking about the distance between Olympia, Washington, and Seattle, Washington, we'd say 60 miles. If you then went back from Seattle to Olympia, you wouldn't say negative 60. You just say 60 miles. So it doesn't matter whether you're left or right, it's always positive. When I see something like this, the absolute value of negative 5, that's how that's read, the absolute value of negative 5. That doesn't tell me what it is, that's just stating the question or stating the problem in a way. It's kind of like saying, what is the absolute value of negative 5? The absolute value of negative 5 is asking you, how far away from 0 is negative 5? And so the answer would be, the absolute value of negative 5 is 5, because it's 5 units away from 0. So we can do all of these absolute values. You might try them on your own, but we're just asking, how far away from 0 is 13? Well, it's 13, right? It's 13 away. Remember, it doesn't matter in absolute value if we're starting from the left or the right. We're just finding out how many units away we are. If the absolute value of negative 1/2, well, 1/2 away from 0. That's what we're asking. Absolute value of a decimal number, just how far away from 0 is it? That's all it is. Remember though, we're using positive values because it's a distance, and we don't care when we're talking about absolute value whether it's left or right. We just want to know the distance. The next topic is opposites. Opposites are numbers that have the same absolute value. So in other words, they're the same distance from 0, but in opposite directions. I think I'm off screen a little bit with that, with opposite directions. So we can look at pairs of opposites, like the number negative 2/3. Well, I had that off screen, sorry. Negative 2/3. The opposite of negative 2/3 is positive 2/3. What's the opposite of positive 7? It's negative 7. Remember, we don't put a positive sign in front of positive numbers. We just assume that it is positive, right? And so what's the opposite of positive 15? Well, that would be the opposite of positive 15 would be negative 15. What's the opposite of negative 8? Well, the opposite of negative 8 would be 8, because 8 and negative 8 are both 8 units away from 0, happen to be in opposite directions. What does this say? This says the opposite of negative 7. Well, the opposite of a negative would be a positive. So you can put as many negatives as you want in front of something. You can figure it out if you think about it as being the opposite of your innermost number. Sometimes you see something like this. Find the value of this absolute value of negative 10. Well, as I said before, absolute values are always positive, but that negative in front has nothing to do with the absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 10 is 10, but that negative in front has to be there again, so we get an answer of negative 10. We did not say that the absolute value of negative 10 is 10. We're saying the opposite of the absolute value of negative 10 is negative 10, because the absolute value of negative 10 is 10, and the opposite of that would be negative 10. So be careful when you're doing something like that. And the other thing I wanted to mention was reciprocals. You had to deal with reciprocals when you're dealing with fractions. You remember the reciprocal of 2/3? We flip it upside down and it becomes 3/2. Remember the reciprocal thing? I just want to remind you that all you're doing for a reciprocal is flipping it. So if you have something like negative 1/4, the reciprocal of that, I'll do that as a flipping sign. It's not really. I should have done that over here, something consistent. When you find the reciprocal of something, you flip it, but you don't change the sign. So the reciprocal of something like negative 1/4 is negative 4/1. We flip it, we don't change the sign. Obviously, if it's positive, it stays positive. If it's negative, it stays negative. And that's always going to be the case. And that's an important thing to remember for later on. So if you had something like -6 and you want to find the reciprocal of -6, you're going to flip that. You want to think about that as being over 1. We can always make something a fraction by putting 1 under it. And now when I flip that, I get -1/6. So remember that when you find a reciprocal of a number, you don't change the sign, you just flip it. And the last thing I want to do on this video is have you plot a few values onto the real number line. The real number line goes forever in both directions. And truthfully, we would say that we are going towards infinity. This is the infinity symbol right here. In other words, it gets greater and greater and never ends as you go to the right. And as you go to the left, we're actually going to negative infinity. And so if you think about going forever in both directions, there's no center. But we're going to call 0 the center because it's a number that doesn't have a positive or negative charge to it. So we're going to call that our center. So if I ask you to put the number -2 on this number line, well, you would go back from 0, 2 to the left, because as we go left, we get negative. And you can put a point right there and say that is -2. If I ask you to put the point 3/2 on there, well, 3/2 is halfway between 1 and 2. Excuse me, 1.5. Sometimes it's good to make those into decimals, and you can see more what they'd be. So I could put a fraction on that number line. I can put a decimal if I want. Let's say I have 5.2. Well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 5.2, I'm not going to be exact because I don't know exactly where it is, but it's definitely closer to 5 than to 6, and I could call that 5.2. So I can plot those, and on the computerized version, when you're plotting points, it has the little marcation so you can do it easier. If I wanted to plot the number 4.5, I would go back -3, -4, -5. This is -5, this is -4. -4.5 would be halfway in between those 2 points. But I can put decimals, fractions, whole numbers. I can put irrational numbers on the real number line because any number that's real can fit there. But it's going to be an estimated spot, right? Because it's not an exact number because it never ends, but we could get pretty close. And so pi is 3.14159. I'm going to say this is where I would put pi, just after 3. It's not exact, but I can put those on there. So when you want to plot a number on a number line, you just put that point coordinate there, and then you put the number that goes with it, and that's how you can plot numbers on the number line. And notice that if I wanted to talk about opposites, -2 is here, its opposite would be +2. They're the same distance from 0 in opposite directions. All right, that's it for